When the new supply begins to fail, something very specific happens inside the narcissistic psyche. At first, she doesn't recognize it as failure at all. She tells herself the excitement has simply faded, or that the other person has changed. But beneath that rationalization, a deeper panic is forming. The new supply was never meant to be a partner. It was meant to be a mirror. And when that mirror stops reflecting admiration, desire, and emotional submission, her sense of self starts to destabilize. You see, the narcissistic identity is not built on a solid inner core. It is constructed around external reinforcement. Attention becomes oxygen. Validation becomes survival. So when the new supply stops providing consistent emotional fuel, when boundaries appear, when fatigue replaces fascination, the illusion collapses. This is not disappointment. This is ego injury. Carl Jung would describe this as the moment the persona, the carefully curated mask, can no longer hold back what lies underneath. What emerges is not reflection, but agitation, restlessness, irritation without a clear source. She may escalate demands, provoke conflict, or withdraw suddenly, all in an unconscious attempt to regain control over the emotional environment. The failure of the new supply forces her to confront something she has avoided her entire life, inner emptiness. And emptiness, to the narcissist, feels like annihilation. This is the critical turning point of the entire cycle, because once the external illusion breaks, the psyche enters emergency mode. The mind begins searching desperately for stabilization, someone, something, anywhere to restore the false sense of power and identity. And this is where the story truly begins. Remember this: when someone cannot sit with themselves in silence, it is not confidence you're seeing, it is fear. And the moment you stop being a mirror, you stop being controllable. At this stage, most people assume the narcissistic woman immediately turns back to an ex, a former source of comfort, or someone familiar who once gave her stability. But that assumption misses a far more unsettling reality before she reaches outward. She turns inward, not in reflection, not in growth, but in confrontation with the part of herself she has spent a lifetime avoiding. This is not self-awareness, it is psychological collision. Carl Jung spoke of the shadow as the rejected unconscious aspect of the personality. When the new supply fails, that shadow pushes forward. The carefully maintained self-image begins to fracture, and for a brief but intense moment, she is alone with her own thoughts. This is where anxiety spikes, where emptiness becomes audible, where distraction no longer works. It feels unbearable because her identity has always depended on being seen, admired, or desired by someone else. In this internal space, the mind scrambles to regain control. She replays past interactions, reframes events, and subtly alters memories to protect her ego. People who once challenged her become villains in the story. Those who tolerated her become proof of her superiority. This internal rewriting isn't calculated, it's instinctive. The psyche is trying to survive the threat of self-exposure. What's crucial to understand is that this inward turn is temporary and deeply unstable. She is not integrating the shadow, she is fighting it. True inner work requires humility, responsibility, and restraint, qualities the narcissistic structure cannot sustain without collapse. So instead of growth, the mind prepares an exit strategy, and here is the insight that changes everything. The more comfortable you become with your inner world, the less power someone else has over you. When you stop fearing your own depths, you stop being useful as someone else's escape. Once the internal confrontation becomes too intense, the ego steps in like an emergency system. This is where the narcissistic mind shifts from discomfort to defense. The goal is no longer to understand what is happening, but to stop the pain at any cost. Jung would say the psyche is protecting the persona from collapse, even if that protection comes at the expense of truth. At this point, reality itself becomes flexible. Memories are edited, motives are reassigned, and responsibility is quietly relocated onto others. Past partners are reframed as toxic, controlling, or emotionally deficient, Conflicts are remembered without context. Harm is minimized while perceived slights are magnified. This is not lying in the conventional sense. It is a psychological reflex. The ego cannot survive prolonged exposure to guilt or self-doubt. So it constructs a narrative where she remains blameless and misunderstood. This is why smear campaigns often follow the failure of a new supply. Speaking badly about others serves a dual function. Externally, it gathers sympathy and validation. Internally, it reinforces the story that she is the injured party. The more convincing the narrative, the more stable the ego feels. Power in this moment comes from being believed. What's often overlooked is how exhausting this process actually is. Maintaining a false identity requires constant energy. Every interaction becomes a performance. Every relationship turns into a stage. And the deeper the defenses go, the further she moves from anything resembling authentic connection. This is where contrast becomes revealing. A person who has done inner work can sit with discomfort without needing to rewrite reality. They can admit fault without losing their identity. They can face truth without collapsing. So here is the reflection to carry with you. When someone must distort the world to feel safe within themselves, their power is already gone. Real strength begins where defensiveness ends. After the ego has exhausted its internal defenses, the mind begins to search outward again. But now, with a very specific purpose. This is the moment many people recognize, the sudden message, the unexpected call, the reappearance that seems almost nostalgic. But it's important to understand what is actually happening here. She is not returning to you as a person. She is returning to a memory of regulation. In her psychological map, you represent a time when her inner chaos was stabilized by your presence. You listened. You absorbed emotional volatility. You adapted. That made you valuable, not emotionally, but functionally. Jung would say you became part of the psychic scaffolding that supported her persona. When that structure collapses elsewhere, the mind instinctively reaches for what once worked. This is why the return often feels strangely hollow. The words may sound familiar, even warm, but something essential is missing. No curiosity about who you've become. No genuine accountability, no interest in mutual repair. The contact is exploratory, almost diagnostic. She is testing whether the old dynamic can still be activated.
Well, people misinterpret the moment. They see it as regret, longing, or realization.
In truth, it is risk assessment. Can this person still soothe my ego? Can they still respond? Can they still be pulled back into orbit? Your response or lack of one becomes decisive. Engagement restores her sense of influence. Silence forces her to confront the uncomfortable truth that the emotional supply she once relied on no anger exists, and that absence is far more destabilizing than rejection. Understand this clearly. When someone reaches for you in their moment of collapse, it doesn't automatically mean you are valued. It means you were effective. The power you hold now lies in choice. And the moment you choose self-respect over familiarity, you step out of the role they assigned you and into your own life. If she does come back, what often unfolds is not reconciliation, but measurement. This is the phase where power quietly replaces emotion. The interaction may appear calm, even reflective on the surface, but underneath it serves a single purpose: to determine whether influence still exists. Jung understood power not as dominance over others, but as the ability to shape inner and outer reality. For the narcissistic psyche, losing that ability feels intolerable. This is why apologies, if they appear at all, tend to be vague. They soothe without surrendering control. Accountability would require a stable self, and stability is precisely what is missing. Instead, the exchange revolves around subtle tests. Does your voice soften? Do you explain yourself? Do you re-engage emotionally? Each response becomes data. Emotional availability signals leverage. What makes this stage particularly dangerous is its familiarity. The dynamic may feel almost peaceful compared to earlier chaos, but peace here is not repair, it is temporary equilibrium. It exists only as long as power remains asymmetrical. 2. The moment you assert boundaries, question motives, or refuse to play the old role, the tone shifts. Irritation emerges, distance appears, the mask slips again. This reveals a hard truth many struggle to accept. Healing was never the goal of the return. Healing requires mutual vulnerability and sustained responsibility. Power requires only reaction. And reaction is far easier to provoke than growth is to maintain. From a psychological standpoint, this is the fork in the road. You can step back into a familiar role that costs you your center, or you can tolerate the discomfort of stepping out entirely. Jung spoke of individuation as the courage to become oneself, even when it disrupts existing bonds. So reflect on this carefully. Anyone who needs power over you cannot walk with you. And the moment you stop reacting, you reclaim the authority they were trying to borrow from you. What ultimately destabilizes her more than rejection, silence, or even exposure is something far quieter. Your growth. Not the performative kind. Not the kind that seeks recognition, but the kind that alters your inner posture. When you no longer explain yourself, no longer replay old conversations, no longer need to be understood by someone who refused to understand you. A psychological shift occurs. You have stepped outside the relational field that once defined her sense of control. From a Jungian perspective, this is individuation in motion. You have integrated parts of yourself that once sought validation externally. You have faced your own shadow, the need to be chosen, the fear of abandonment, the urge to fix what was never yours to heal. Doing so, you removed yourself as a psychic resource. And this is something the narcissistic psyche cannot negotiate with because it offers no leverage. She may never consciously articulate what she senses, but she feels it. Your presence no longer stabilizes her inner world. Your absence no longer provokes panic in the same way. You are no longer reactive, predictable, or emotionally accessible on demand. In psychological terms, you have become autonomous. And autonomy is profoundly threatening to anyone who relies on others to regulate their identity. This is why growth, not confrontation, becomes the final rupture. There is no argument to win, no narrative to distort, no emotional cord left to pull. The dynamic ends not with drama, but with irrelevance. And irrelevance is the one outcome the narcissistic ego cannot metabolize. For you, however, this is not loss. It is return. A return to self-authorship. A return to agency. A return to a life no longer organized around someone else's instability. So take this with you. When your healing no longer needs an audience, you have already won. And the life you build from that place will never require you to abandon yourself again.